Hi everybody, we are going to read chapter 3 of Flat Stanley today. The title of chapter 3 is Stanley the Kite. Mr. Lambchop had always liked to take the boys out with him on Sunday afternoons to a museum or roller skating in the park, but it was difficult when they were crossing streets or moving about in crowds. Stanley and Arthur would often be jolted from his side, and Mr. Lambchop worried about speeding taxis or that hurrying people might accidentally knock them down. It was easier after Stanley got flat. Mr. Lambchop discovered that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string around Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a little loop in the string for himself. It was as simple as carrying a blanket, and he could hold on to Arthur with the other hand, so he would roll Stanley up and able to hold Arthur's hand. So let's roll up Mrs. Meckley. So he rolled him up and tied a string on him and just carried him like that. Pretty nifty. Stanley did not mind being carried because he had never much liked to walk. Arthur didn't like to walk either, but he had to. It made him mad. One Sunday afternoon in the street, they met Mr. Jones, an old college friend of Mr. Lambchop's. "Well, George, I see you have brought some wallpaper," Mr. Jones said. "Going to decorate your house, I suppose?" "Wallpaper?" said Mr. Lambchop. "Oh, no, this is my son Stanley." He undid the string and Stanley unrolled. "How do you do?" Stanley said. "Nice to meet you, young fella," the man said. "George," he said to Mr. Lambchop, "that boy is flat." "Smart, too," Mr. Lambchop said. "Stanley is third from the top of his class at school." "Phony," said Arthur. "This is my youngest son, Arthur," Mr. Lambchop said. So there's Mr. Jones, and he's telling Stanley, "Good to meet you." That's a very polite thing to do. And he'll apologize for his rudeness. Arthur could only blush and apologize. Mr. Lambchop rolled Stanley up again, and they set out for home. It rained quite hard while they were on the way. Stanley, of course, hardly got wet at all, just around the edges, but Arthur got soaked. Late that night, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop heard a noise out in the living room. They found Arthur laying on the floor near the bookcase. He had piled a great many volumes of encyclopedias on top of himself. "But put some more on me," Arthur said. Wonder what he's trying to do. So this is Arthur soaked in the rain, and he looks mad. So now he is piling books on him like this. So what do you think he's trying to do? He's trying to make himself flat. He's jealous. "Put some more on me," Arthur said when he saw them. "Don't just stand there. Help me." Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop sent him back to bed, but the next morning they spoke to Stanley. "Arthur can't help being jealous," they said. "Be nice to him. You're his big brother after all." The next Sunday, Stanley and Arthur went to the park by themselves. The day was sunny, but windy too, and many other boys were flying beautiful, enormous kites with long tails made in all the colors of the rainbow. Have you guys ever flew a kite? Yeah, I like flying kites when it's a windy day. Arthur sighed. "Someday," he said, "I'll have a big kite. I'll win a kite flying contest and be famous like everyone else. No one knows who I am these days." Stanley remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed a large spool of string. "You can fly me, Arthur," he said. "Come on." He attached the string to himself and gave Arthur the spool to hold. He ran lightly across the grass sideways to get up speed, and then he turned to meet the breeze. "Up, Once Stanley, being a kite, he knew just how to manage on the gust of wind. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to rise, and let it take him down from behind when he wanted speed. He had only to turn his thin edge to the wind carefully, a little at a time, so that it did not hold him, and then he would slip gracefully down towards the earth again. So here's Arthur, and let's follow that string up to Stanley. That is so cool. He's flying the kite. Arthur let out all of the string, and Stanley saw high above the trees a beautiful sight in his red shirt and blue trousers against the pale blue sky. Everyone in the park stood still to watch. Stanley swooped right, and then left. Matched swoops. He held his arms up by his side and zoomed at the ground like a rocket and curled up again towards the sun. He side split and circled and made figure eights and cross and a star. No one had ever flown the way Stanley Lambstrop flew that day. Probably no one ever will again. After a while, of course, people grew tired of watching, and Arthur got tired of running about with the empty spool. Stanley went right on through, showing off. 3 boys came up to Arthur and invited him to join them for a hot dog and some soda pop. Arthur left the spool wedged in the fork of a tree. He did not notice, while he was eating the hot dog, that the wind was blowing and the string got tangled in about the tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley did not realize how low he was until leaves brushed his feet, and then it was too late. He got stuck in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard his cries and climbed up to set him free. So Stanley was showing off, and he didn't realize he was in danger. He got all tangled up into the tree, but his brother wasn't paying attention either. Stanley would not speak to his brother that evening, and at bedtime, even though Arthur had apologized, he was still cross. Alone with Mr. Lambtrop in the living room, Mrs. Lambtrop sighed and shook her head. "You're at the office all day having fun," she said. "You don't realize what I go through with the boys, though it's very difficult." "Kids are like that," Mr. Lambtrop said. "Be patient, dear." Okay, we're on chapter 4, so stay tuned.